Yeah, and I think, I've had to hear it many times, but one of the harder times was when I was in the hospital for two surgeries back to back, May 20th and May 26th in 2013. And that was actually over my birthday. My birthday is the 21st. And so I had the surgery on the 20th, and then it failed that night. And the neurosurgeon was like, I was just in there. I am not going to do this again. I'm going to send you home. And I kept begging him. And he stood in the doorway on my birthday at 9:30 at night. Like, none of the lights were on in my room, and I could only see his silhouette in the doorway. And he said, I don't know what this is. I'm just going to send you home. And then he walked away. And
that's a scene from a movie.
Right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So, I just kind of had to cry to myself in my bed, by myself in the hospital after going through a couple of surgeries already, and, just not wanting to be blind and not knowing if I was going to go permanently blind, because that is an issue too. If you have too much pressure in your brain for too long, you can blow out your optic nerves.
Hey there, and welcome to In Sickness and in Health, a podcast about chronic illness, disability, medical traumas, and everyday uncomfortable healthcare experiences. My name is Kara Gill. I'm not a doctor or a medical professional. I'm just a person and a patient who really wants to talk about this stuff more. Nothing said on this show should ever be considered medical advice. If you're experiencing a medical issue, please seek qualified medical help. I know the system sucks, but I do wish you a lot of luck. Every person is different, even within disease groups, so none of my guests should ever be regarded as official representatives or spokespersons for their conditions. Please respect their very personal choices, and unless they ask for it, please don't make suggestions about treatments or lifestyle changes. Unsolicited medical advice is never not annoying. In today's episode, Chelsea talks about her long-term mystery symptoms that doctors labeled an unknown rare disease, her complicated relationship with shunts placed to relieve intracranial pressure, her recent Lyme disease diagnosis that may or may not explain everything, and the lack of knowledge and research that makes that still unclear. I also talk about my own jaunt down the rabbit hole of Lyme disease, which you can hear me talk about in more detail on my episode of the Lyme Voice podcast, which I'll link to in the show notes. Even though we talk quite a bit about Lyme disease in this episode, I don't want to misrepresent it as an episode about Lyme disease. I'll do plenty of those in the future with people whose Lyme experience is a little bit more clear-cut. That is, if anyone's Lyme experience is clear-cut. My own experience with the disease was complicated by my underlying genetic condition, and Chelsea only very recently received the diagnosis and has yet to figure out where it fits into her diagnostic picture or how it will affect her treatment. In today's bonus episode, we talk about the emotional trauma of being undiagnosed for so long, positivity and inspiration porn, her blog and misadventures in dating, and the sometimes dangerous business of being a woman in the world. This week, the CDC officially released its new prescribing guidelines for opioid medications aimed at reducing addiction risk. These guidelines are not mandatory, but many legitimate pain patients worry this will further jeopardize their access to necessary pain medication. In case you missed it, a couple weeks ago, I talked to Jen about needing regular opioid pain medication at a time when those medications are public enemy number one. We talked about why she needs access to these medications, how poorly we deal with drugs here in the U.S., and how challenging it can be to really treat chronic pain. We discussed the important distinctions between addiction, abuse, and dependence, and the many trade-offs and compromises we often have to make in treating chronic health conditions. So check that episode out if you haven't already. You can find Chelsea's blog, The Sick and the Dating, at thesickandthedating.com and in the show notes. You can also find Chelsea on Twitter, and on Fridays, she co-hosts Sickadilly Chat with Nikki Seesfeld on Blab, a new platform for live streaming video discussions. I was on a couple weeks ago talking to them about crowdsourcing difficult diagnoses. This Friday's chat will be about the challenge of superbugs in healthcare, and will be at 5 p.m. EST, or you can catch the recording afterwards. I will link to my appearance on Sickadilly Chat and this week's chat in the show notes as well. Find resources and more from us at insicknesspod.com and on social media at insicknesspod. Subscribe, rate, and review us on iTunes, which helps other people find the show. And now, I'll let Chelsea tell you about where her medical saga all started.
So, it all started back in Minneapolis in 1979. And I started having these perfectly round patches falling out in my hair and couldn't figure out what was going on. And at that time, we were going to a place called Smiley's Point Clinic, and they were for families that were low income, which unfortunately we were. And it had all these residents that were putting in their hours before they became, full-fledged doctors. And so they got a lot of practice off of us, too. And so kind of went through this process of making sure it wasn't ringworm or whatever, and then figured out that it was alopecia. And usually kids that start out with alopecia areata, which is the perfectly round circles, they grow up to be adults and then develop the alopecia universalis.
Oh, interesting. I didn't know that.
It's a much higher frequency than if you develop the hair loss as an adult. Usually you can make it through adulthood and just deal with the patches. Sometimes it turns into totalis, but it's pretty rare. So when I was little, too, I was also very, very sick all the time. I always had really bad asthma. We always knew around Labor Day every year that I would be on the couch or in bed or at the hospital because I would always react to the air pressure and stuff like that. And we found out just last year that I'm actually, my IgG3 and IgG4 are deficient, and so I can't fight infections like most people can. And that was just by accident, just by all this testing that we've had to go through with this. So when I was about 23, 24, I developed all the symptoms of fibromyalgia, and we went through the process of ruling out lupus because there are other autoimmune diseases that run in my family. My mom has lupus, and my uncles have some other conditions. My grandma had a condition, and my sister now came up with a diagnosis about 5 years ago as well. So it definitely runs in our blood. And when I was about 28, I lost all of my hair completely. And the way that they treated that was they did injections in my scalp for about 4 years, and they did 75 injections every 3 weeks.
Wow.
Yeah, so it wasn't comfortable.
What were they injecting? Do you know?
Yeah, it was basically prednisone. So every 6 months, every 6 months I would get an injection in the hip as well. So I was on a lot of steroids, even though they said that it wouldn't hang out for very long because of the location of the steroids in my scalp. I was like, I'm still getting them, And not for the short amount of time that they would have preferred. I went much longer because we were still trying to hang on to my hair. And so I lost all my hair at about 28. And was kind of limping along until I turned, 31, and then I was diagnosed with Hashimoto's, and that explained why I had a hard time losing weight, and I would always be cold. Otherwise, it hasn't really affected me terribly in that area. And then when I was 36, I came down with the big mystery symptoms, and I became very, very sick. That was kind of crazy. So I walked down part of the Grand Canyon, like down into the canyon with a friend in 2009. And nobody ever talks about Lyme disease in Arizona. Supposedly it's a very low occurrence because of the climate, but the Grand Canyon is at a much higher elevation than Phoenix. And so the wildlife is different, the foliage is different, the temperatures are different, and they are definitely just like Minnesota and just like New York, and definitely a breeding ground for these little bloodsuckers. So I didn't realize that I had picked up a tick, and later on in that year, I started getting these mysterious symptoms. Like I always felt like I was rocking on a boat.
Ugh,
and then
I hate that feeling.
Yes. Now it's constant, but
you get used to it.
Yeah, unfortunately. And then I got this really stiff neck. Like, it was so painful that I couldn't sleep for 4 days, and I was crying and hallucinating, and it was just horrible. And the doctors couldn't figure it out because, again, Lyme isn't something that anyone thinks about down there. Quite frankly, their Board of Health doesn't allow you to report it, and they're not required to.
Right.
And they just had no interest in my case whatsoever when I tried to talk to them about it this past couple months. So for a long time, the doctors thought that I had a really rare condition. Nobody could figure out why I was having these issues. And so the problems graduated to me having really severe vertigo and having a droop in my face. And then my speech was slurred. My toes point inward when I walk, and so they kind of flap a little bit. Some of the symptoms remind me of MS, and some of the symptoms are kind of like myasthenia gravis, which, by the way, they're testing me for again this month, and I think it's totally useless, but, whatever, I'll jump through the hoops.
Right, what's another test?
Right. I got nothing but time. Yeah, so I had really struggled for a year to find any doctors who would help me, and that was from 2010 to 2011. And I wasn't able to work because I wasn't able to actually be upright at all. And I was going to doctors who were all saying, we don't know what this is, and don't come back again. And that has been the recurring theme for years and years now. And the weekend of my birthday, in May of 2011, I heard from my boss, and she said that the company that I was working for was getting ready to can me because I couldn't find any answers. And they weren't taking my short-term disability very far with me. They kept denying me and stuff like that. So I was on the verge of financial ruin. And, of course, I was just emotionally distraught because I couldn't figure out what was going on. And I finally went to the ER at St. Joe's in Phoenix. They are connected with Barrow Neurological. And I thought, if anything, maybe those doctors could figure out what I had. And so they admitted me into the hospital and they did a bunch of tests again. And the only thing that I hadn't had done before was a spinal tap. And the doctors hadn't tried that because they didn't think that I had MS, and I didn't think I had MS either. And so they did 2 spinal taps 4 days apart, and for 12 hours each time, my symptoms resolved. And so they got a neurosurgeon on board, and he said, great, I think that you're a shunt candidate, and let's get you taken care of.
And for people who don't know, can you just explain what a shunt, like what the purpose is and what it does?
Yeah, so it's a glorified tube that runs from either your spinal column or your brain to your abdomen. It drains out into your abdomen, and it's basically reabsorbed into the intestines. And it takes the fluid out of the whole tract of your spinal column and your brain and reduces the pressure. So I had my first shunt placed in July of 2011, and they put it in my spine, and I had the worst time with it. First, they put the setting too low, and so too much fluid was going out. And I've had more experiences with it, but having too much fluid taken off of your brain is really super painful too. And women who have ever had an epidural, who have had this issue where they've developed a leak, they understand. And usually their problem is taken care of within a day or two. They get a blood patch, which means that the radiologist will inject blood from your arm or whatever source they can get it from into your spinal column, and it forms its own little blood clot, and then you're fixed. So they had me dialed too low. For 2 days, I couldn't get out of bed. I couldn't drink anything or eat anything. I was in really rough shape. So they brought me back in. The first thing that one of the doctors said to me was, well, Chelsea, you would get much better if you just lose weight.
Oh, God.
Right? And I said, it's not going to happen in an hour. I'm not going to lose, 70 or 80 pounds. And so why can't you adjust my fluid in my brain so I'm not in such horrible pain? And so he finally did. And I had to go back to the ER many times because I was leaking directly out of my back. I was leaking cerebrospinal fluid, which is the consistency and color of water, but actually pretty scary because, if you get any infection in your column, then you're screwed.
Yeah.
So I had to have a bunch of ER visits. They tried sewing me up a couple of times. And then the last time they finally brought me into surgery and they just kind of redid all of the stitches inside and out. So I seemed to hold up okay for a while. And I started getting these horrible, horrible abdominal pains. Stabbing, they make me double over and sweat and, cry. And those have started since day one of having a shunt in me. So that's been a separate issue, but, definitely related. It's not my imagination. Right? That we just love that word, don't we?
Yeah.
So I was good for a while. For 2012, I actually started getting some relief from the abdominal pains. And I made a promise to my friends over in England. I said, if I can actually get stronger and still feel okay, I'm going to come over and visit you. And I did. And exactly a year from my first surgery, I was in the Amsterdam airport and I was crying my eyes out with a bunch of strangers who had no idea what was going on, but I was just so grateful, to be functional at that point. And then kind of towards the end of 2012, I started getting sick again. And that started the whole series of surgeries that I had after that point. And so all of my symptoms came back, and they started coming back every 2 to 3 months, sometimes after a month, sometimes even less time than that. And my body just does not like having a shunt in it. Doesn't like having a foreign object. And so it strangles the shunt, it clogs it, it breaks it apart, you name it, it's happened. And so I had 6 surgeries in 2013, and they were pretty much happening like every other month. And I ended up having 2 shunts in me at one time, one in my back and one in my brain. And that was because they were afraid to take out the one in my back that kept failing because they didn't want to create another hole where I would have an issue with low pressure and the painful headaches. Yeah. So finally, in the end of 2013, it was over Christmas. My neurosurgeon had to work by himself. He didn't have a surgeon to help guide the catheter in the front. And so he had to do a much bigger cut in my abdomen. And he actually saw for himself. He said, "Chelsea, your abdomen looks like a war zone. Now I understand why you have all this pain in your abdomen. You're obviously reacting to the shunt." So we figured that out. And then a month later, again, my shunt failed. And he said at that time, "I don't want to do anything until we figure out what's going on with you." Because after he told me about my abdomen looking so terrible, I told him I want to go to an immunologist and I want to go to a rheumatologist, because I'm either having an allergic reaction to it or an autoimmune reaction to it.
Right.
And at first he was like, "Oh, yeah, whatever. You don't know what I'm talking about." Right?
Even though, up to now, you've been basically right about everything, right?
Everything, including my shunt. They're supposed to be free-flowing in your body. They're not supposed to attach to anything, at least for a very long time. So the surgery in December actually took about 3 or 4 hours longer than it normally would have, because he spent that whole time trying to get the catheter out of me. Because I grew so much scar tissue that it's what he sees after 20 years, not after 3 months.
Wow.
Yeah. So there hasn't been anything that I've been wrong about up to this point. So I got an immunologist and I got a rheumatologist and started going through testing. And I had some reactions when I went to the immunologist. We actually tested the shunt parts. And so she referred me to the Mayo Clinic in Phoenix. So I went to the guy. He's actually a dermatologist, but he's a specialist in rare allergies like silicone. So I went through that testing. And even though I had positive results the first time, I had negative results the second time, and he said, "Oh, okay, then you're not allergic to it, right?" And he was a sweet, sweet man. I mean, wonderful bedside manners, but, I still have never been wrong,
Right. And just the circumstantial evidence of you had this thing in your body, your body's reacting poorly to it. You already had one positive test, just because you didn't happen to react on that day. So frustrating that he would just be like, "Oh, you're fine."
Right. Yeah, are you kidding me? Yeah. So it actually took me almost an entire year, and that whole time I had a leak. And so I had to be on some really heavy-duty narcotics and luckily I was working from home, and so I didn't have to go into the office. Otherwise, I would have definitely lost my job.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was a really, really difficult year. It was so, I still remember the pain. It reminds me of being beaten over the head by a tire iron. Not that I've ever had that.
Yeah, that doesn't
But
sound like my idea of a good time.
right. And it happened, every single time I was upright.
Mm-hmm.
So it didn't matter if I was up for 2 seconds or 2 minutes or whatever. I mean, every single time. So imagine, like, if you're laying in bed just to try to keep the pain down, but you get up to go to the bathroom and it's going to be just horrendous.
Yeah.
And, that was a really tough year. It was really difficult. And we also figured out that I was allergic to the metal dial in the shunt, which I had been telling them about too.
Mm-hmm.
I couldn't stand to have anything touching my head. I couldn't wear a wig or a scarf or anything. And I actually, I got on the medical marijuana program for a while too, because I was trying just about anything to not be in that much pain.
Mm-mm.
And they finally got like an old school shunt that doesn't have any metal in it. And the purpose of the metal is that the idea is that if you ever need an adjustment to your shunt, if the doctor doesn't guess what it should be right away when he's putting it in at surgery, then later on, with the adjustable ones, they can come along with this crazy 007 magnet that they carry around in this case. And it actually dials the shunt. Like, it tells you what reading it's at, and then it flips the dial around, and yeah. So I lost the ability to be adjustable. Mm-hmm. And so now I have just this tube with a flap in it, and they do something with it. They do some stitches, or they do something where it chooses the setting before it's placed in you. And then, so if your brain reaches a certain pressure, then the flap opens and presumably lets the fluid off.
Right.
So I've had 10 surgeries total. My last surgery was May 11th of 2015. And I was in his office on May 28th of 2015 to get my stitches out, and my shunt failed again.
Oh, no.
Yeah, and he said, that's it. I'm not going to operate on you anymore.
So then what? Like, what did he expect you to do after that?
He said that, I could go to a neurologist if I wanted to, or he kind of was out of ideas. And also, at that point, I had decided to move back to Minnesota rather than stay in Arizona. My family really urged me to come back to a closer area where they could keep an eye on me and help me out when I needed it. So, yeah, I uprooted my life. I had to sell my house, which was beautiful. I had to give up everything. And now, since I don't have a working shunt, I also can't drive because I lose a lot of my vision and my face droops, and I get really bad vertigo. And so I'm useless.
That's hard because you're like essentially stranded in that case.
Yeah. And I have gone all over the place, and it's really, and also the first job I got when I moved to Phoenix was a travel job. I was a traveling software trainer. And so for me to go from that to being stuck in my bed a lot is really, really tough. It's just not my personality.
Yeah. When you moved to Minnesota, is that when all of the doctors started saying, like, please don't come back? Or had they been saying that for most of this time?
Forever.
Yeah.
Yes. So right now, by my count, I think I'm up to 47 or 48 doctors that have seen me. Yeah.
What proportion of that would you say? Well, I guess all of them, basically, right? Said don't come back.
No, luckily not all of them. I mean, the neurosurgeon tried to help me as best he could, and a couple of other doctors kept me on. So I've had about 2 doctors here in Minneapolis and then 6 doctors down in Phoenix that never said don't come back or I can't help you. So I was really grateful for that because it's a very lonely process.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I haven't had the best history with relationships either. And so even when I was with somebody, I was alone and had no support whatsoever. And so, some of those ER visits were really, really difficult because, the doctors were nasty to me, or the nurses were nasty, or just, a lot of stonewalling and stuff. And
yeah. I mean, even if it's like a best case scenario and everyone's being really helpful and nice, it's still horrible to be in the emergency room by yourself.
Yeah. Yep. There was one time that I was actually back in Minnesota when my shunt failed, and I went to first the hospital that I used to work at 20 years ago in northern Minnesota, or well, mid Minnesota. And, I kept explaining to the doctors what was going on. And this was in 2013 when I had all my surgeries back to back. And he said, we're not equipped for anything like this. We only have a couple hundred beds. We're not high tech like what you're used to. So I'd like to send you down to the Mayo. And I was like, yes, finally, I can go to the actual hospital and, be admitted and be worked on by the top white coats in the country. And, maybe I'll finally get an answer. Not the case whatsoever at all. And this was actually the third time they turned me down, but the neurosurgeon on duty, on call, said, we don't know why she has shunts and we don't know why she has symptoms, and so we're not going to work on her.
Oh, that's very helpful.
Right. So my family basically had to get me on the plane by myself to go back to Phoenix. So I was in total failure, lights out for me. I can only see about 20% when everything goes bad. So I had to rely on strangers to get me around the airport and get me off the plane. They kind of forgot me on the plane.
Oh no.
I mean, just a nightmare for anybody who would be able-bodied, but it was just almost unbearable. And then my poor friend, she took me directly from the airport in Phoenix to St. Joe's to the ER. And she had to go to work, and I was like, it's okay, go ahead and go. Well, wouldn't you know it, that's the day that the whole computer system crashed in the hospital.
Oh, God.
Right. So I was just miserable after doing, 5 hours of travel. And I finally started crying in the ER, and I grabbed somebody, and I was like, please, can you tell them to put me on a gurney? I can't be upright anymore. And first they kind of were stonewalling me on that, too. And then they finally put me down and started working on me, but it was just...
Sounds like a long day.
Yeah. And the computer system was actually down for 3 days, and so I was in the hospital for that long, and it was just a struggle. Everybody was just, tearing out their hair because they had to go back to paper when they hadn't been doing that for years. Yeah. So, yeah.
So at what point did you start kind of going down the Lyme disease rabbit hole? Had that been suggested at all up to that point?
Not really. My mom had asked me to help out my uncle because my uncle got really sick in July, a month after I moved here last year. And he sounded just like I did. His speech was slurring and he was stuttering and stuff. And he sounded monotone, which I sometimes do when I get really bad. And so I was trying to help him out, and Mom was like, Chelsea, he sounds a lot like you do. Do you think you have the same thing? And I was like, no, because I was in Phoenix. Where would I pick up a tick? They don't have them. Ha ha ha.
So he had already been diagnosed with Lyme disease.
Yeah, my uncle, he's mostly in Minnesota and Florida. And so he has a cabin up in northern Minnesota. And so I'm sure being outside and working on it and whatever, he probably picked up something. Yeah. And another uncle of mine actually has chronic Lyme as well. But, all the symptoms are different.
Yep.
Just depends on what stage you're at and how bad the bacteria infiltrated every part of your being and what it tagged along with.
And what you have going on underneath. Because if you already have a genetic disorder or an autoimmune condition or a immune deficiency, if that's already there and then you add to it an infectious disease like that, then things really get wacky.
Right. Yeah. Totally screwed.
At what point did you start pursuing that as a possibility medically?
Well, I didn't even really pursue it. I went to a naturopath because I was having trouble with being in bed for so long. I was having a lot of pain with my fibromyalgia. And so the first visit that I had with this naturopath, she said, so have you been tested for Lyme? And I was like, no, not really, because, it just hasn't been on my radar. I just don't think that I have it. And even, a lot of my symptoms aren't the same as what my uncle was experiencing, besides the speech problems. Mm-hmm. And she really kind of pushed me. And so, the second or third visit I had with her, she said, okay, I'm going to give you this kit. What you have to do is you have to go in for a blood draw at the hospital, and you have to give them a check. When you send in this kit, it's going to go to Igenics over in California. And their testing is a lot more sensitive than the testing that we have locally.
Mm-hmm.
And I actually, when I got my test results back, they do the ELISA and then the IgG and the IgM Western blots. And so the ELISA and the IgM are the ones that you do if you think you've been infected within the last month.
Mm-hmm.
And then the IgG is the one that you do if you think you might have been infected much longer than that. And so, of course, the ELISA and the IgM didn't have really anything. I did get like it's indicative that I might have something on the ELISA, but it wasn't like a high level. And so since it was indicative, they still went through with the other tests, and on the IgG, it lit up like a Christmas tree to the point where I was actually positive for the CDC standards.
Oh, okay. Which is something that actually does not happen a lot.
Right. But, it probably is because my immune system is already compromised.
Yeah, that definitely can make things a lot worse.
Yeah. Yep. So I got that diagnosis on January 21st of this year. And the first thing that I did, after I kind of sat on it for a while and did a little bit of research and said, okay, is this really what I have going on? Because I have been misdiagnosed before. Mm-hmm. And it seemed to match everything. And so I sat down and I wrote 10 letters to 10 different doctors. And some of the doctors were really helpful, and they were the ones that kept me on. And I thought that they deserved to know what this mystery was, or at least what I thought it was. Mm-hmm. And I got a response back from one of the doctors, the immunologist, and she said, I talked to the Board of Health and I tried to report your case, and they said that we don't have Lyme here in Arizona.
Yeah, that's a big problem in a lot of places.
Right?
Yeah.
And then I wrote back to her after I talked to the guy who is actually stepping down as the head of the Lyme Association down there. He said, we've noticed that the ticks fly in with the birds, and the birds don't know to avoid Arizona. So they come in on the birds. It's definitely there. We definitely have cases. It's not your imagination. And, they've had 53 cases so far reported for the state of Arizona. But that's through the CDC, not through the state. The state still does not allow them to be reported. Mm-hmm. And these are cases where people have never left the state, where they're small children, just all kinds of different cases, but the state won't allow them to be reported.
Right, which is problematic, to say the least.
Right, and, might have caused a lot of us to be a little bit smarter about how we spent time outdoors and what we checked for when we came back in. Because in Arizona, we worry more about scorpions and snakes than we do, ticks, because we weren't told that there were 20 different kinds of ticks hanging out in Arizona and that they probably carry all these bacteria.
Right. And a key to treating Lyme effectively, or at least attempting to, is catching it early. And you can't do that if you don't know that you haven't gotten a tick bite, because only, maybe half, they're not really sure, but maybe half of the people get that telltale bullseye rash. But if it's on, you could just not have the rash and not notice that you had a tick bite. But also if it's on a part of your body that you don't look at, that can come and go and you can never know that it's been there. And ticks are so teeny tiny. They're so tiny. Because I contracted Lyme disease in 2008, and that was a whole thing. And I had always been really vigilant about checking myself for ticks because I grew up in northern New Jersey. It's an endemic area. Lyme disease was a thing that people got all the time, and they just went to the doctor. They got antibiotics, and then they get better. But the key was catching it early. And I'm a very white person, but I have a lot of tiny freckles and moles and stuff, so it's actually really hard. Especially after I had Lyme disease, I didn't go into the woods for a long time because I was really freaked out. And now when I do, I get kind of a little nutty checking myself because I'm like, is that a mole or a tick? I can't tell.
Right. And the deer ticks that supposedly carry the Lyme bacteria, those are much smaller than the wood ticks that we're used to. Because I used to get wood ticks all the time when I was growing up, and we lived across from a park reserve, and so we'd always go walking over there. And I can't tell you how many times, like, I've had to lay on the bathroom floor and have one dug out from behind my knee, or, dug out from behind my ear or something like that. So, I didn't, I just didn't know that you could have it in Arizona because I had grown up with it, but I thought that I had left that behind.
Right.
Yeah. Yep. So lately I've been going to the U of M, the University of Minnesota. I do have a doctor there who's my primary care now, who is used to really complex cases. And I notified her about the Lyme diagnosis. As far as I know, she's keeping me on as a patient. She's not sending me away. But now I'm seeing other doctors, like I saw a pain doctor, because I have really bad abdominal pain from rejecting the shunt still. And I'm having problems with hip pain and stuff. And the pain doctor was like, I have never seen anything like your symptoms before. Because when I'm upright, I have all this craziness going on, my paralysis and stuff like that. But when I lay down, the fluid drains off of my brain, and I can actually move my eyebrows and blink my eyes and do that stuff without looking weird.
Mm-hmm.
And so he's like, I've never seen anything like this. I think that you have a rare thing. And then I was supposed to go to a movement disorder specialist. He's a neurologist with a U as well. And he was looking at my chart, and he was like, you're not coming in on Friday. We're going to send you for more tests, and we're still going to rule out myasthenia gravis and, whatever else. But he thinks it's super rare too. And he said, I don't think that this is just Lyme. I think that you have something else going on.
Right. Now, have you been treated for the Lyme disease at all, or?
There is, no, I got the jackpot. There's a Lyme literate doctor who is a half mile from me, and she takes my insurance.
Oh, wow.
Which I know never, ever, ever happens, right?
Yeah. And a lot of the Lyme literate doctors don't take insurance because most insurance companies don't believe in the existence of persistent Lyme infections and yada, yada, yada.
Right.
And it's a whole mess, but yeah, that's amazing.
Right. Yeah. So that's exciting, but she's out of town until March 20th. So, yeah, she's negotiating with my naturopath to try to get me in sooner than kind of the big long list of people she has waiting to get in to see her. I started doing naturopathic stuff, and I'm not sure how effective it is yet. I mean, it just, if it works, it's going to take a long time.
Right.
And this is kind of the stuff that needs the big guns, but I'm also allergic to a big long list of antibiotics.
That's not good.
Yeah. So the one that they usually use, doxycycline, that is related to tetracycline, which I am absolutely positively allergic to, hives, asthma, so I can't do that. And I know that there are some others, but I have to make sure that they are not close to anything that I am allergic to, because, yeah, then I'm toast.
Yeah. Well, the good news is it seems that antibiotics aren't particularly effective in treating Lyme disease. So at least there's that.
Bom, bom, bom.
Yeah. Oh my God. It's such a disaster. So when I contracted Lyme disease, I had it for about 5 months before I realized I was sick because I had this, underlying health stuff. I was just so used to feeling like crap all the time. I didn't realize that I was sicker. Because what had happened was we went camping upstate for my boyfriend at the time's graduation party. And that was like Memorial Day weekend, I think. And then that Tuesday, I started training for a new job in retail. So I went right from that to being on my feet all day in a very stressful situation. And then school started again. That was really stressful. So it took 5 months for me to be like, hey, wait a minute. This is a lot worse than it used to be, because I had the neck pain and the neck stiffness, which is like one of the cardinal symptoms. But then also I have an underlying heart condition that may or may not be related to Ehlers-Danlos syndrome. We don't know.
Right.
But I'd had episodes of that arrhythmia my whole life. So I knew that was there already. But then all of a sudden it was happening every day, multiple times a day. So like all of a sudden there was all this stuff that was much worse. And even in northern New Jersey, where we know that we have ticks that carry Lyme disease and we know that tick-borne infections are endemic, I still had a really hard time getting my doctor to test me for Lyme disease, first of all, and then actually treat me for Lyme disease because the test came back negative, which is not uncommon. Plenty of times, especially earlier on in the infection, they're testing for antibodies. They're not actually testing for the presence of the bacteria. So
Right.
they were like, well, your test came back normal. I don't know what to do with you. And I was like, how about you just give me antibiotics? And I'm not somebody who demands antibiotics all the time.
Right.
I'm very sensitive to them and I would prefer not to take them. So I did a month of doxycycline, threw up a bunch. I almost threw up on one of my coworkers, which was hilarious.
Oh my God.
And, it was after that, some of those new symptoms that I had started to dissipate and get a little bit better, and then had to go down this whole rabbit hole with the heart condition. But it wasn't until I think 5 years later, I had a routine, STD panel, just, checking it out, making sure everything's okay. I did not expect to have any, positive results. And I got a call from the New Jersey Board of Health being like, hey, so your test came back positive for syphilis.
Oh my God.
Yeah. And I was like, that's interesting, and yeah. And so the guy starts asking me all of these questions. And one of the questions was actually, have you had Lyme disease before? And I was like, yes. Oh my God. Yes. Why are you asking me that? But yes. And it turns out that the syphilis bacteria and the Lyme disease bacteria, they're both spirochetes. So they're actually cousins of each other.
Yes.
So if you have antibodies from a past Lyme infection, it can cause a false positive for syphilis, which was not fun to learn the hard way, because their protocol is to start treatment immediately, which are antibiotic shots in your butt, to start treatment immediately, and then test your partners to make sure that they don't have it. And then, because even the confirmation test is still only about 50% accurate. So it was about a month and a half of just being I might have syphilis, but maybe not, but maybe not. And I felt that way so many times over the years of being I might have Lyme disease, but maybe not, but maybe,
Right.
but maybe not. I'm not really sure. Because even when I was, looking into why does my body hurt so much years later, which eventually led to getting my EDS diagnosis, several doctors were have you been tested for Lyme? And I had to go through the whole story of what happened. And it's I don't think I still have Lyme disease, but I might, but probably not, but maybe. And there's just no way to know, because the tests aren't great. And because they're testing for antibodies and not the actual presence of the bacteria, if you've had a past infection, you're going to have the antibodies. So it's just this big mess of I might have it, but even if I do, what am I supposed to do about it? Because the treatments aren't that effective. And, so it's just, I don't even know where I'm going with that, but it's a mess.
It is. And, it's depressing when you see those little graphics about who gets the most funding. And so, of course, cancer does and AIDS does. And now the Zika virus is going to be getting tons of funding. And West Nile, which, we've had in Arizona too. I don't know why they think that mosquitoes can travel, but ticks can't. But,
well, to be fair, they do have wings.
Whatever. Yeah, not that long of a lifespan, though.
Yeah.
But, yeah, so it is depressing to see that after these 3 or 4 decades of us being aware of these Lyme spirochetes, that we still don't have effective testing or treatment, and there's still a lot of denial.
Mm-hmm.
And, sometimes, I don't know if you feel like this, but I do, that we are the people with MS around the turn of the century, or maybe even earlier, when I'm sure that they were thought that they were just batshit crazy, and really they had all these lesions all over their brain and spinal columns, and this is why they were losing the ability to walk or, speak or whatever. I feel like we're that bunch now, and it's growing exponentially, but we still don't have anything We don't have the funding. We don't have the research.
Yeah, I mean that's the biggest problem is the research. We just don't know. Like we have no idea how long this bacteria can it persist in your body. We don't know how to treat it. We don't know why some people develop long-term symptoms and some people don't. And there's like all of these known unknowns and then a bunch of unknown unknowns that we are so far behind because this is something that does not get anywhere near enough research funding. And it's not just Lyme disease. One thing that I've found in doing so much of my own research over the years is that, there is a whole huge, I would say, the majority of illnesses, like we just don't know enough about. And there's all of these people who are having mysterious symptoms, but they probably don't all have the same thing, because the more that I've learned about different stuff, it's like, oh my God, these symptoms cross over with so many other diseases,
Right.
which also makes Lyme disease really hard to diagnose. They call it the great imitator because it has all of these like seemingly unconnected weird symptoms. But I realized, so first was the Lyme disease thing, and then we were looking into like, maybe do I have like a mitochondrial disorder? And then I was looking into EDS, and I heard the same thing from lecturers in all three spaces, which is like, if you have a patient who has symptoms that involve 3 bodily systems or more, this disease should be in your differential diagnosis. So when I heard that the third time, it really like clicked in for me that like, oh shit, there's so many of these diseases that we just know nothing about and are super undiagnosed, but it's not all the same thing either.
Yeah.
Which is hard when it comes to like the Lyme disease community, because there definitely are people that had underlying health conditions. There's definitely people that do have long-term Lyme disease, but then there's also people who probably have something else. And because we don't have the knowledge, we can't parse that out and figure out what's going on with who and where. And it's hard to know who to trust, because obviously there's this huge, disagreement on the scientific side of it, but also, on the treating patient side of it, there are definitely doctors who have good intentions and are really trying to help people. But there's also plenty of people, equally as many, possibly even more, who are taking advantage of people.
Yeah.
And that to me is really distressing and really scary because, there's this vacuum of knowledge which leaves open the possibility for people to really be taken advantage of.
Yeah. And, the rule of technology is that it's supposed to double every 18 months. So, we have some really great things that are coming out. Like, there was this suit that was being featured at the electronics convention in Vegas this year. Mm-hmm. And people would strap it on, and whoever was running the program on it could make you feel like you were 70 years old.
Oh, no.
But you know what? That's a really great training tool, right?
Yeah.
Because you want doctors to be empathetic.
Yeah.
So, they would make the knees kind of ache a little bit, or make everything feel a little bit heavier, or make you walk slower, or make your vision not as great. And we can do things like that, but we still can't figure out what in hell Lyme is.
Right.
So it's really discouraging.
Yeah, I find myself very frustrated by that. Because also, like, as far as science communication goes, what things we are learning from research are often very distorted by the media reporting it and stuff like that. And so, you always see these stories about, like, incredible scientific breakthroughs, but, like, we still don't even know what Lyme disease is, or like, I keep coming back to the idea of endometriosis affecting 1 in 10 people of menstruating age, and it still has all of the same problems as a rare disease.
Right.
We are lacking a lot of very basic science, and it's so frustrating to see these, scientific breakthroughs hailed as some sort of like, I don't know, technology savior when we're so far behind on very basic things.
Right. And, women are about 40 years behind men in any kind of research. And so they will always research men on their heart attacks and in their cancers before women will will get any of the majority of the funding. So,
Right.
endometriosis, I'm sorry, you have another, 40 years?
Well, that's another thing that it's like, maybe I have it, but I don't know.
Right.
Because they can't tell me unless they cut me open and look inside.
Right, and
which
he
is
wants
bananas.
exploratory surgery. Yes.
Yeah, I mean, especially for somebody like me who is high risk because of dysautonomia and because of EDS, like surgery, even laparoscopic surgery, is really like a last resort kind of thing. So it's not something that I'm like aching to do real quick or anything like that. I was supposed to get a colonoscopy last year that didn't wind up happening because of, my underlying health stuff.
Well, you're not missing anything.
Oh, I know.
Yeah.
I was really dreading it, so I'm glad it didn't wind up happening.
Let me tell you, there is no greater indignity than peeing out of your ass.
Oh, God. Just tell me about it.
Yeah. Yeah, it's, it is frustrating because we do have all these other conditions going on. And so, it was really difficult for me to even get doctors to listen to me because just with saying I have fibromyalgia, nobody wants to touch that.
Which is ridiculous because it is definitely a thing. And there are people who are suffering and no one wants to help them.
Right, yeah.
It's...
Yeah, at most, I feel like right now, they just want to sing me some camp songs and send me on my way.
Right.
So that's been tough.
Right. So I'm going to ask you a last question. This is my new question that I'm going to start asking everybody. Is the American healthcare system as fundamentally unsustainable and irreparable as I happen to think it is?
Well, just the fact that you're laughing through that question kind of answers it for you. But just like we evolve with our technology, we should also evolve with our healthcare. We should understand that people's needs are going to evolve. Abilities are going to change. Even the jobs that we do are changing very obviously. I mean, we don't work in factories anymore. We also shouldn't have the same healthcare that we thought might work 70 or 80 years ago.
Yeah, I read a lot about medical history, and I'm currently reading a book called Medical Apartheid. It's about the very dark history of research and experimenting on Black Americans and Black Africans by American scientists, which is a whole thing. The book is very long, but when I read about medical history, it is amazing that humans survived at all.
Right.
Because prior to germ theory, we were doing some pretty wacky shit that, like, it's amazing that anyone actually survived.
Right. I mean, we finally figured out hand washing, and even then, we're not even up on that.
Yeah.
Yeah, it is crazy. It's crazy to think about. But we also can't become complacent. The current political situation right now is that we're very polarized, and we can't let our health get caught in the middle of that. We can't let everybody fall through the cracks. Yeah.
So, is it as fundamentally unsustainable as I think it is?
Oh, let me answer that again. Hell yeah. Yeah. I mean, even over in England, they're figuring out that the NHS isn't quite working, and so they're going to have to make some changes. I don't think that they should change their system to make it more like our system.
Yeah, that's a real bad idea, you guys. Please don't do that.
Yes, please, 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 from the bottoms of our hearts. Don't even think about it, because every time I go over to visit there, that's one of the first things that we talk about with my friends and everybody they introduce me to. They're like, so, Chelsea, you want to talk about the healthcare over there? And I'm like, yeah, I almost hit bankruptcy, half a dozen times and didn't know where I was going to get money for food. And there's a lot of shame involved with it. And they're like, oh, thank God for the NHS. They just have to hear that.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's kind of what I've been seeing, especially because I actually have a really surprising amount of international listeners that I hear from. And it seems that, like, it's not really working anywhere, although Norway seems to have a pretty sweet setup. But even there, people have problems with access and stuff. And I'm just not sure, like, how do we move forward? What direction do we go in? There's so many aspects, especially in our system, because it is so large and so spread out and, so
and also
complex.
Profit-based.
And really.
I really don't like anybody making money off of my body because I'm the one going through all this crap. But, that's a whole different show.
Yeah, that is a whole different show. That's a good place to end, though. Thank you so much for talking to me. This was fun.
Yeah, thank you
And
so much,
thank
Kara.
you for listening to In Sickness and in Health. Find resources and more from us at insicknesspod.com and on social media at insicknesspod. Subscribe, rate, and review us on iTunes, which helps other people find the show. And don't forget to be excellent to yourselves and each other.